So, good evening. Welcome to this recording of a webinar session sponsored by UU Mystics in Community with Dr. Don Weiner on the subject of broadband spirituality in the 21st century. This is the second of 4 consecutive weekly sessions that we're having these discussions. Tonight is Tuesday, September 17th. We're having sessions the next 2 weeks as well. And all of our recordings will be posted at our website at uumystics.org. So with that introduction, I'm happy to invite you back, Don, to the second week of your presentation.
Well, welcome everyone. So last time I talked some about some general topics such as what's the purpose of a spiritual path, why engage in the process of awakening, what does awakening mean, and I told a few science stories. I told the story about the random number generator research that Roger Nelson has done, where he showed that regular people could alter a little computer that generated random numbers to make the output non-random. And more remarkable than that, if the data was stored from a previous day but not looked at by anyone and not printed out, people could change the output from the previous day at a certain time of the day. So the past could be changed by something that happens in the present. So spirituality is a lot about learning how to change our vantage point, our perspective on things. And many traditions, particularly Buddhism and Sufism, talk about the importance of us learning how to overcome our conditioning. Well, that doesn't just mean conditioning about what we were taught in terms of belief systems growing up. It's about the conditioning that takes place by the way that we perceive the world, which is through the physical senses. And so we tend to believe, and in fact, it seems kind of strange to even question that there could be more to the world than what we're capable of perceiving with our physical senses. But if we've studied anything about science and astronomy, we know that there's frequencies of the electromagnetic spectrum that we can't perceive that some animals can. So, for instance, bees can perceive ultraviolet light, and other animals can hear ultrasonic frequencies, and elephants can hear very low frequencies that are inaudible to human beings. So there's much more to even the physical environment than what we assume, but we're so conditioned by what we see, we just think, well, this is all that there really must be. And the same thing when we look out at the night sky, look at the stars, we think, well, that's the universe. That's what I can perceive. If I have a powerful enough telescope, I'll be able to see further and further away, but we can't see in infrared or ultraviolet frequencies, and we have radio telescopes and X-ray telescopes that can pick up structures that are not perceivable through ordinary visible light. And if you've ever seen pictures of that, it's just amazing. Some of these structures that are there, but they're absent from our consciousness unless we have some tool to help us discover them. So in a later class, we're going to be getting into some tools for awakening. And what does that mean? Well, a lot of times people may think, well, I don't want to do Buddhist practices. I don't want to do practices that come from Hinduism or fill in the blank mystical Judaism or mystical Christianity or mystical Islam, because my belief system is, and then fill in the blank with that. And that could be some other religion. It could be being an atheist, whatever it might be. We think, well, there's nothing that these other traditions have to offer to me, because obviously I'm using all that I need to be able to discover all that I want to discover. But over hundreds and in many cases thousands of years, these different spiritual traditions have developed, you could call them technologies for working with consciousness. And it's not necessary to incorporate belief systems for the particular traditions to benefit from them. And prime example is mindfulness, which has become very popular, and you see books about it everywhere, apps you can get for your phones for mindfulness meditations. And this is a Buddhist practice, but it doesn't require any particular belief system. It's just a way of perceiving that is different than our usual helter-skelter way of perceiving things. Mystics of different traditions talk about awakening what they call subtle senses. And again, from our usual way of thinking, we go, well, there's no other way of seeing than with the eyes. There's no other way of hearing than with the ears, and so on. But mystics have described different subtle senses of an inner sight, an inner hearing, an inner taste, an inner touch that is independent of external physical manifestation. And there are many, many spiritual practices to help awaken these faculties. It's something that anybody can do. But again, if let's say you go to a restaurant that you've enjoyed going to for many years, and you pick this thing off the menu and that thing off the menu, but you didn't realize that there was another menu that isn't widely distributed, that if you knew what was on it, you could pick some things from that. And it's kind of like these possibilities of faculties that we can develop through spiritual techniques for working with consciousness can enable us to have a much richer way of experiencing and perceiving what's going on in the world. So let me talk a little bit about science here. Last time I think I mentioned Gödel's theorem. I'll mention it again. He was a logician, mathematician, I believe philosopher, that he proved that if you have any set of principles, axioms, at least as interesting as those for the natural numbers, two numbers a and b, a plus b equals b plus a, and so on, that there always be a statement you can make which you couldn't prove or disprove. And that shows no matter what assumptions you have for any field of science, there's going to be something that you're not going to be able to get to based on your assumptions. And what Gödel concluded, you either had to take something and assume it's true, and that's a new axiom, or assume it's false, and that's a new axiom. But this kind of boggled my mind when I came across this, because I thought there has to just be a truth out there. How could something either be true or false depending on what your assumptions are for the way that the world works? Well, either one would work. They're models, but they contradict each other. There is a man named Bekenstein who has this principle that is now called Bekenstein's bound. And the simplest way to describe this is, let's imagine, Raymond, that I took you into a room and set you down in front of a computer screen, and I told you that there's some omniscient being on the other side that you can communicate with. You can call that being whatever you want, God, or just some very advanced person from the future that's mastered time travel that has all this knowledge. And you can ask whatever you want, and they'll explain whatever they can explain. Well, Bekenstein proved by a very simple proof that you don't have to be a mathematician or a physicist to understand that there's a finite limit to how much information that can be conveyed in either direction through a screen or an interface. And an example of an interface would be a computer screen, but any kind of interface. And it's limited to the size of the screen. So even if you could somehow have a mechanism to communicate with some very advanced, let's say omniscient being, there'd be a finite limit to what they could tell you, but there'd also be a finite limit to what they could learn about you that could come through this screen, this two-way process. So if you think about spirituality as being more than an individual process of awakening, if you believe that there is a collective awakening that goes on in existence, that, well, we know that there is a principle called self-organization, that life has a tendency to organize towards higher and higher states of complexity. That if you believe that that's the case, then everything is moving towards the possibility of greater understanding of itself. Each part evolves towards a greater capacity to understand how it connects and relates to the totality, but the whole system, you could say, is evolving towards a greater understanding. And I mentioned last time a computer scientist at MIT named Seth Lloyd that has theorized that the universe is a gigantic quantum computer. This is an article in Scientific American, by the way, not National Enquirer, Scientific American. And when he asked the question, well, what is the giant quantum computer computing? And his answer was itself. It was like to know itself. Well, this is the same thing the mystics have said for a very long time. In fact, the Sufi mystics say that God was a hidden treasure desiring to be known, so the divine being brought about existence, but the divine could only know of him herself by what could come back from all that's present in existence. So we can apply Bekenstein's bound to this. Even a divine being has a limit to what could be known or what can be known in existence from that or back in the other direction. But regardless of how you look at it, if you think that the totality is engaged in a never-ending process of evolving towards a higher and higher degree of understanding and wisdom, then a very perhaps different way of thinking about a spiritual path is you're not just doing this for your own benefit, although there's definitely benefit that occurs from being on a spiritual path. I mean, anything as simple as where you feel more peaceful, you can deal with difficult circumstances better. There's a lot of research that's good for your health and so on. All that is definitely true, but you're also contributing something that can only come through you. So here's another principle we're going to be talking about, and that's the idea of uniqueness. Ibn Arabi, who was a Sufi mystic hundreds and hundreds of years ago, said that every soul has access to a unique part of the divine wisdom that no other soul ever has or will or could have access to. And if you want a perhaps less spiritual sounding model, you can take it from a scientific model. Two things that are in identical quantum state are the same thing. Well, two human beings could certainly not be in the same quantum state. Each one is in a very different quantum state. So just by the virtue of the fact that each of us is a unique being implies that our way of experiencing is unique. And you don't need logical proof to understand that. Everybody sees the world a little bit differently. Everybody's personality is at least somewhat different. Everybody's concepts about the world, what the world is about, is different from everybody else. And even people's experience through the senses is not the same. People probably perceive colors a little bit differently than other people, or hear things. I mean, what frequencies they're able to hear, and the same with the other senses. People have very different thoughts in response to things that they experience and learn. A scientist is going to have very different thoughts about something that he or she observes than probably an artist would have, or a musician would have, or someone whose main thing is sports. It would just be thinking in terms perhaps of fitness and so on, and becoming more accomplished at a particular sport. So each of us has got something very unique to contribute towards the totality, and we become more and more capable of doing that when we enlarge our interface with the totality. Well, what does that mean? It doesn't mean going out and buying a bigger TV set, although, of course, bigger TV sets are nice. But it means awakening to capacities that we have that go far beyond the usual physical senses, that go far beyond the usual linear ways that we have of thinking about things, go beyond the usual ways even emotionally experiencing what's going on in the world. And you could say it's coming to a very different frame of reference. And by frame of reference, I don't mean just something static, well, it's always the same vantage point to something. It's something that is adaptive depending on circumstances, but more important than that, it is something that is evolutionary, that if we're growing spiritually, our way of relating and understanding and experiencing has to be evolving all the time. And if we look back to earlier times in our lives, certainly our way of experiencing is very different than when we were children, or probably when we were teenagers, and those of us who are older, even when we were young adults, our sense of ourself probably has shifted significantly. And throughout all those years, there was still this fundamental sense of I'm me. That doesn't go away. And I think it's an old notion of spirituality that to really reach the goal of a spiritual path, that sense of personal identity needs to just disappear. Either because in some systems it was illusory to start with, there never was a separate you, or that even, well, yeah, you could say there was something that was there for a time, but the whole point is to merge back into where we came from, or whatever you want to call that, whether you want to call it the divine being or the transcendent or the beyond, and just in some traditions dissolve into this infinite ocean of bliss. Well, that sounds pretty good. However, if you think about that, you might ask yourself, well, if that's really what it was about, then many of these systems are saying, well, that's how it all was to start with. It was all just this one, whatever you want to call it, infinite, beyond words, beyond name and form. And then somehow an existence came about. And if the whole point was just to go back to where it started from, then at least in my mind, it raised the question, well, what's the point of all that? Well, yes, there's experience of beings along the way, but it doesn't seem to be a fulfilling purpose if that's all that it's about. And I think that more and more people are coming to think of the existence that we're in as something that is continuing to evolve, and that includes whatever way we have of thinking about what the transcendent aspect of it is, whether we call that God or just the beyond, whatever it is that's beyond the physical world of manifestation, the world of the senses, the world of concepts, and so on. To me, it's much more meaningful to think about that whole system of which we're an integral part of, and of which we're deeply interconnected with everything else in that system. And once again, here we have a meeting of science and spirituality, because the physicists have come to realize that we do live in a deeply interconnected universe. And they have terminology such as the zero-point field, the quantum vacuum. The Sufis have a term for the place that is no place. I think it's really all talking about the same thing, the underpinnings from which existence arises and then goes back to something beyond name and form, that it would be impossible for anything to be separated from that totality, that everything is having an effect on everything else in the universe all the time. Well, and here we have another obstacle to overcome, and that's our sense of, well, what does that mean all of the time? We think of time as now and what's happening next and what's happening next, but it's an arrow of time that moves forward into the future. And it's very challenging to think about a reality in which the effects go not only forwards in time, but backwards in time, and everything is influencing everything else throughout all the different ways that time flows. We are not used to thinking like that, right? But there have been the experiments I told you about with the random number generators, the yesterday's data being changed on the following day, only if it hadn't been looked at. If it even had been printed out the day before and no one looked at it, it wouldn't work. Or if someone just saw it on the screen, even if they didn't analyze it, it wouldn't work. It has to just be sitting there stored somewhere. But something today can change something that happened yesterday. So this is called retrocausality. Our minds are not at all accustomed to thinking this way, but the scientists are showing us this is the reality that we live in. So we think it's challenging sometimes the way language works to express ideas, but I'll do the best I can. We think that the world we're in, according to our perception of it and our conception of it, is the way that the world is. But it isn't. It's a narrow, tiny slice of what reality is all about. The physicists now theorize that there's probably at least 10 different dimensions. This is from string theory. And some string theories say, well, there's 21 dimensions, but let's just pick 10. That's enough. Well, we're only conscious of 4 dimensions, 3 of space and 1 of time. You know, what's with these other 6 dimensions? Many, perhaps all the spiritual traditions that I'm aware of, and all the different religious traditions have some notion of other worlds and called by various names: the afterlife, heaven, planes of existence, spheres of existence, and so on. And just like different traditions have different names for the portions of the spectrum, the different colors, but some of them have divided up very differently. They wouldn't have red and yellow and green. They might have other names that have other parts that overlap what we call different colors. And who's to say which one's right? Nobody can say that. It's just a different way of conceptualizing a phenomena that's continuous. So how do you juggle this, what the scientists are saying, 10 dimensions and religions and different spiritual traditions are going, different subtle realms of existence? Well, now there's been a lot of research done on subtle energy. I mentioned William Tiller last time, and I would encourage you to check him out. His latest book, I think, is the easiest to understand, but he's done many experiments on subtle energy, and he's found that whenever something is done that brings subtle energy to whatever the experiment is, the usual laws of physics are different than what they normally are. There's a contribution from the subtle energy that, if that linkage has not been established, is zeroed out. And that's why many, if not most, physicists go, well, there's hogwash, I don't believe this, I just see what I have in my experiment and my theories. But if they look at the evidence, you can't argue with it. These are replicable experiments that show that consciousness intention can be stored in inanimate pieces of circuitry that can actually have an effect on changing the pH of water, not even being in physical contact with it, and can change the laws of thermodynamics in the room that they're in, so that there's now more order instead of the normal, which would be there's less order. Instead of increased entropy, which means disorder, there's increased negentropy, which means increased order. These things are impossible by the usual laws of physics. And when we say law, what's implied with that? Well, that's got to be the way things are. It's a law. You can't break the law. It can't be anything else besides this. But there's a concept or a term I mentioned last time that I think many scientists suffer from, which is called scientific fundamentalism. And this means that there is a belief system. Go back to Gödel, these assumptions about a system and what you can prove or disprove with that. Well, many scientists have a set of basic assumptions about the way the universe is, and anything that doesn't fit in with that, they believe can't possibly be true, it's faked, or I don't know what that stuff is, but I don't have anything to do with that. I'm doing serious science in here. That's something else. We don't go there. So many scientists, though, even back from the early days of quantum physics, were very mystical. Let's see if I can find quotes here. Well, these are more contemporary ones, but so here's some theories from different physicists. The quantum vacuum could be a sea of information and a conveyor of information. if the vacuum is a frictionless medium, the wave memory of the universe may be eternal. Whoa, pretty heavy duty. Irvin Laszlo, who's written many wonderful books, his hypothesis is the quantum vacuum generates the holographic field that is the memory of the universe. Mystics call this the Akashic field. And one of his books has got the Akashic field in the title there. Here's another goodie. This is from a cosmologist. The vacuum fluctuations that gave rise to our universe were modulated due to the information conveyed to our universe by a prior universe. I'll read that one again. The vacuum fluctuations that gave rise to our universe were modulated due to the information conveyed to our universe by a prior universe. This accounts for the coherence in our universe. Whoa. So we're familiar with the idea of the Big Bang, and then, you know, people ask questions, well, what was before the Big Bang? And the answer you get is, it's a meaningless question because time didn't exist before the Big Bang, space didn't exist before the Big Bang. But at least some cosmologists now have a theory of what they call the multiverse, and that is that there's an evolution of universes, plural, that universes are born through a process like the Big Bang, and they have their finite lifespan, like our universe. I think the last proton will decay in 10 to the 100th years or something, and there'll just be a sea of subatomic particles. But their theory is that somehow all the information that was gained from a whole creation and the ending of a previous universe becomes the seed of the creation of a new universe, and so that information is not lost. It's like the starting point of the next one that comes, and there's an evolution of universes, kind of like Darwin's theory for universes, which is pretty far out. Well, in Hinduism, there's this amazing book called Ka, K-A, and it's the only writings on Hinduism I've ever seen, because in traditional Hinduism, you have Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Brahma, the creator of the universe; Vishnu, the preserver; Shiva, the destroyer. And then in the Hindu scriptures, it just is all Leela or Maya. It's the dream of God. It is there, it disappears, and then it starts all over again. Well, in this book, Ka, he talks about this in terms of, no, it doesn't start over all over again. The next cycle of creation is the same thing the cosmologists are saying, is seeded with all the wisdom that's been gained in the previous universe. It's not lost. So again, here you have cosmologists on one hand, you've got mystics on the other hand, and they're really talking about the same thing with different language being used. Here's some more from physicists. The underlying physical reality is a holographic field in which everything is connected with every other thing. The cosmos is inherently creative, and everything in it is part of a mutually dependent system which is constantly evolving. So it raises the question, what is the purpose for existence of ourselves and the universe as a whole? And one answer could be, it's the evolution of the metaverse, the whole kit and caboodle, into greater states of complexity. And in an individual, that's on the cosmic level. On the individual level, consciousness evolves in a person from being ego-bound, limited to solely to the personal vantage point, the personal sense of identity, to a transpersonal vantage point, which does not erase the individuality or uniqueness, but encompasses much more than that. So let me pause here for a bit and see if anybody has any comments or questions about what I've said so far. And if you do, just unmute yourself and hold your hand up and I'll call on you. Yes, Lee, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay, am I unmuted now?
Yes, you are.
Okay, so you're talking about awakening the senses and to have inner sight and more sensory perception. And what do you experience as the relationship between that and consciousness? Because, you know, sometimes people seem to be sensitive to those kind of things and not very conscious, or I just didn't know what your experience is of that.
Okay, that's a great question. So you're right. There are some people who are naturally much more sensitive and haven't undergone any kind of spiritual training and have different psychic abilities or can see auras and pick up things that most people normally can't. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're more spiritually evolved than anybody else. That just is really how their nervous system is wired. So I would say that in the process of awakening our potentials and being able to achieve expanded and deeper states of consciousness, it's a very helpful skill to be able to awaken subtle senses. But just awakening subtle senses by themselves is not necessarily going to be, in fact, it isn't all that is going to be sufficient to be able to grow spiritually. It's just something that's helpful because it enables us to make a shift from our usual vantage point to a very different vantage point. So maybe one example I can give, everyone's probably been in some just beautiful place in nature, in the mountains, in the wilderness somewhere, and you just had this sense of awe, and you had a different sense of time, and you felt a deep connection with everything. Colors seemed brighter, your hearing seemed keener, and so on. So you were in a different state of relationship by virtue of the beauty of the place that you were in. So temporarily, you were in a more expansive state of consciousness. So just because you were able to experience that in the beautiful place doesn't mean it's going to automatically carry over when you're stuck in rush hour traffic. So the challenge is to be able to develop skills that can be applied across circumstances that we find ourselves in, especially in our day-to-day life. And we're going to be talking some more about that in a later meeting. But if spirituality is just about going inward and higher in the transcendent, that's all well and good, but it's not fulfilling the purpose of being a human being, and it's certainly not probably going to help make the world a better place. You know, if everybody started doing that, well, who's going to deal with things in the real world? And so we'd like to have a spirituality that's a balance between the inner dimensions and the outer dimensions, and ultimately to discover and realize that they're not separate. They're just different ways of directing consciousness. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Other questions or comments or thoughts this is triggering in anybody about the way you look at your spiritual growth or the way that you relate to the world?
I have two questions for you. One, you used a term earlier that had the word retro in it.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could give me an example of that, and also what role, if any, do you see psychedelics playing in what you're talking about?
Okay, well, retro, I was talking about retrocausality.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that something that's happening in either the present or the future can affect something that's prior in time to that event. And this has been well established in physics. There's experiments that, if you read them, I mean, they're mind-boggling, but they're replicable, that time is not the way that we think it is. And we're very much conditioned by assuming that time only flows in a linear way, just as we are conditioned by a linear way and a dualistic way of relating to the world. In terms of psychedelics, well, psychedelics have pointed many people, especially in the 60s and 70s, to the fact that there was much more to reality than meets the eye. The problem with that is that if people just continue to rely on those, for one, there's states of consciousness that are far beyond what any psychedelic could ever take you to. And the other is that, and this was from my spiritual teacher, Pir Vilayat, that I studied with for 25 years. And he could see people's auras. And initially there was no rule in the Sufi order that I belonged to about drugs, because there's no dogma or anything. But he finally felt that he had to impose a rule about drugs, because he felt that he could see that people were damaging their etheric bodies with drugs. And this is a problem that isn't just in this life, that this continues to what's afterlife. And he had to say, no, this is not helpful. But I think psychedelics do have benefit in some circumstances. They're being used with post-traumatic stress disorder. They're being used with cancer patients, and I think they're very valid uses of psychedelics. Recreational psychedelics, I think, like I said, they can only take you so far, and relying on those can make it much more difficult, even if someone stops, to go beyond where the psychedelics have taken you to. That's not the end of it, just because you had amazing visions about this or that.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
You were speaking earlier about the balance between kind of the interpersonal and the outer personal, or something like that. And you spoke at the beginning about mindfulness, and you talked about inner tasting and inner hearing. I think it was. I was
Inner seeing.
About, well, what would be an example of that, and what are the spiritual practices, the types of spiritual practices that you think create the right balance for growth, or maybe that changes over time and you just intuit it.
Okay, well, I was planning, next time I'm going to share some practices, but I'll give an answer to your question. Well, one, and perhaps many people have had an experience this of just feeling like there was an inner light that wasn't just something coming on your closed eyelids. It was, the Sufis talk about the uncreated light, or the light that's all pervading, that doesn't come from a point source. And there are practices to be able to begin to experience this kind of light. There are practices to work with awareness. Well, let's just do a very simple one. So take your hands and put them close together. Everybody try this with me. Okay, and then just kind of move them back and forth a little bit. And see if you can feel, so they're not touching. There's a space between them. And kind of go a little further out and back in, and see if you can feel like there's kind of a boundary to the energy there. You can feel like where it seems to be thicker, so to speak, at a certain point. If you get too close, you lose that. Can you feel that? Okay. Now bring your hands a little further out. And if you tune in, you probably can find another place that may be at some distance where you, again, feel another energy. If you put your hands closer, like pointing towards each other, back and forth, like it's got a bigger radius than the one you were at before. And I guess you can't see mine because I've got my hands too far apart, but so if you can feel that, and this is just to raise a question in your mind. The first question is, well, what are you experiencing? And everyone I've ever done this little demonstration with could feel, well, there's an energy here. It seems to be like bounded at this level. And if I go out a little further, okay, it's kind of like another orbital of it. There's one here. And of course, there's a limit to how far we can put our hands out. But what is this stuff? Well, it's some awareness of magnetic energy that's there that we're usually not conscious of. It's a more subtle type of energy that's present, and we can take our hands above our head and kind of just move down around to the sides. And you might want to try this too, and see if you can feel like a energy around your body that's roughly the shape of your body. And as you move down, kind of feels like you're massaging your energy field. So start top of your head and just slowly go down with your hands kind of pointed into towards each other or pointed forward, and just feel like you're just slowly smoothing out the kinks. And then you can go all the way down as far as you can reach. Okay, could you feel something when you did that? Did it feel good? So again, what is this? And I don't have to give an answer to you, but I taught a class one time at All Saints Episcopal Church in Corpus Christi. I called Many Doorways to Awakening, and I said of the participants, the only thing I ask if you're going to come to this is that you be at least an open-minded skeptic. I said, in fact, I welcome skepticism. Don't take something because I tell it to you. Only take it if you feel like there's credible research to back it up or you have direct experience. Well, people could do these simple little exercises that didn't think there could be anything more than what they could normally perceive. And you could see like question marks starting to go off and light bulbs starting to go off. Maybe the world is something more than what I assumed that it was. And then the question I asked them next is, well, wouldn't you like to have some tools to be able to discover what that's about? You know, you didn't know it was there, but if you've got an inquiring mind and a sense of curiosity, there's some methodologies that can help you be able to experience these things. So I'll just mention for this class, there are practices to both become aware of and work on the magnetic energy that not only surrounds our body, but emanates from our body. It's measurable. There are practices to work on the bioluminescent field around our body, otherwise known as the aura. And I think even back in the 70s, UCLA had a machine at their medical school that could measure the different frequencies of light around the body, and it would correspond to what an intuitive would see. Like if the intuitive saw red light around someone's liver, then these machines would be picking up the frequency around the liver of red light, and so on. So there are practices to be able to become aware of these things, and then there's practices to enhance it. So and we'll do some of these next time. There are some very simple practices to increase the strength and the size of the magnetic field around your body. There are simple practices to increase the size of and the extent of the aura that surrounds your body, the light field around your body. So that's already a pretty good start. There are practices working with the breath, and our usual assumption about breath is, well, that's not very interesting. You know, you either breathing in through your nose or your mouth, and you're taking in oxygen and you're breathing out carbon dioxide. So what? Well, breath is probably the single most powerful tool for working with consciousness across spiritual traditions. And we're taking in so much more on each breath than we realize. For one, we're taking in what the yogis call prana, or life energy from space. And just when we think about this, in fact, we can try this one right now. So close your eyes and just let your breathing settle into its normal rhythm, inhaling and exhaling, and just think of what's the reality that we are really breathing in or receiving on each breath. We're taking in the light from distant stars in every direction, you know, trillions of stars, all these photons coming. And the stuff of stars was the origin of the matter that formed our bodies. So it, you know, that saying we're stardust. Yes, we are. We're made of the stuff of stars, from the heavier elements that are generated from stars. So just take a moment and tune into your breathing and feel, let yourself open to receiving this life energy with each breath. And as you inhale, feel that it's not just coming in your nose and going down to your lungs and back out again, but feel that it's going to all the cells of your body, this life energy. And it's catalyzing them. And as you breathe out, you're releasing energy that may be out of balance and goes back into the earth. So just try this for a bit. You're taking in this wonderful prana from the stars, this life energy, and you feel like you're just revitalized by it, perhaps feeling a tingling in your hands and feet. And as you exhale, you're engaged in a process of circulation with the universe. You're emanating light, and we'll do some more light practices next time, but you're also releasing into the earth out of balance magnetic energy, which the earth graciously accepts and recycles. And now we can add a dimension to this. As we inhale, we're not only taking in the life energy from the stars, but we're drawing in magnetic energy from the earth. It goes up through our feet and up through the spine, and it's filtered. As it goes up the spine, it becomes more and more refined and subtle till it gets all the way to the top of the head. And you exhale and you send back into the earth anything that's out of balance. So you're becoming totally recharged and revitalized here. Okay, and then just open your eyes. So what'd you experience when you did that? Do you feel different? Anything shift? And it's okay if nothing amazing happened. We just did this for a couple of minutes, but this is practice you could work with. And as you work with it, you'll refine your ability to become aware of this more subtle form of energy than we're usually aware of, but which is present all the time. So some mystics say that most human beings, in terms of the available light and energy that we could be taking in with each breath, are just really living on life support. I mean, we're only conscious of such a narrow trickle of that, and that's enough to sustain us walking around and going about our daily business. But we could feel so much more dynamic and energized and full of life. So these are practices, as I was mentioned earlier, don't require any kind of belief system. You can try them out, and I can attest from having worked with them for many, many years and known, hundreds of people who have worked with them. They're effective. I mean, it's just like if you get with a personal trainer and you follow the exercises suggested, you're going to get more fit. You don't have to believe anything, you just have to do it. So this is just one very simple way of beginning to awaken subtle senses. And of course, there's more advanced practices. There are practices across traditions working with sacred sounds. Well, what is the sound? A sound is a vibration. Vibrations have an impact on things. I can't remember the person's name, but there's a scientist who's researched just like writing a word on a piece of paper and then putting it in some water and then looking at the patterns that develop on the water as a result. And it's amazing the difference, like what happens with love and anger and so on. There's just these very different vibrational patterns that take place. And the sounds of these sacred words is not just that, well, they have a religious tradition that goes with them and so on. At least 3 languages in the world, Sanskrit and Arabic and Hebrew, the words that are used in spiritual practices aren't arbitrary, but supposedly the words themselves convey exactly what they mean. And so in times in the past, a teacher in a tradition, it could be mystical Islam or Judaism or Sufism or Hinduism, might give someone a sacred word and not tell them what it meant, but when they would work with it, the meaning would reveal itself by the effect of the vibrations and subtle energy centers in the body. So it's very different than English, which, it's got the linguistic origin for different words, but English is not a sacred language. The words don't have that vibration associated with them as they do in other languages. And that's the reason why mantras in Hinduism and Sufism, they're called wazaif, sacred names are in one of these languages, because the effect of the vibrations on the person that does them. And again, if someone works with these sincerely over a period of time, they definitely bring about transformation. It's the effect that these vibrations have. Some of you may remember, this was way back in the 70s, a book called The Secret Life of Plants. Anybody ever read that book a long time ago? Well, the guy that wrote it, I don't remember his name, would take identical plants, and for some of them, he'd play classical music all day long. And for another group of plants, he'd put on Led Zeppelin. Now, I like Led Zeppelin just fine. I went to a concert. They're pretty cool. But the ones with the classical music, the plants started growing around the speakers, and the ones with Led Zeppelin didn't do so well. But it was just the vibration of the music. And even he talks about in this book, they can take an instrument and it measures the electrical activity that's transmitted through a plant. And when someone would walk in a room that had bad vibes, or had just pulled plants up and didn't give it much thought, the plants would react just like a human's electrical activity would that was freaking out. I mean, it would correspond to, like in a human, a great increase in sympathetic nervous system activity. So the plants were picking up on this.
I'd like to.
This book it's a fascinating book. I'd encourage you. It's probably still in print somewhere.
I just wanted to share back on the subject of sound. I was at a UU retreat this year, and we were working with a video that was being shared, and the subject was sound as touch. You're off there in Texas and you're making sound, and it's coming through Zoom here to me. But the point is, it's touching me. It's touching my eardrums. And everything we hear is, in fact, a physical act of touch, that's transmitted through the sound waves and whatnot. But just that whole perspective of all sound is, in fact, a touching of us, I thought was hugely evocative.
Yeah, that's wonderful. What attracted me to Sufism many years ago was a book that I just randomly opened in a used bookstore in Berkeley when I was a student at Stanford. And it was a book by the person that brought Sufism to the West, Hazrat Inayat Khan. And the book was on music, and I just opened it up, and it said, he was saying, music is the highest religion that there is. And when humanity has evolved sufficiently, someday there won't be words anymore with religion. It'll just be music. I don't know what this is about, but I like it. I mean, just that what's able to be communicated with that. And we've all, I'm sure, been deeply touched by different kinds of music, as we are by things that we see. I mean, beautiful artwork or sculpture, or things that we hear, a singer or a poet reciting, or the feeling we get watching someone perform a dance. There's something happening with the whole energy of the environment when we have that kind of experience with something that takes us beyond our usual conditioned reactive way of experience, which is kind of after the fact, thinking about what we're experiencing. Oh, look at that. That's really good. Oh, I like that. Isn't that pretty? As opposed to just being in the thick of the experience, and there don't need to be any words being in there. We're just right there with it, which is a much, I'd say, richer way of experiencing the world than the after effect. Kind of, it's like a secondhand reality that we tend to go around in. And included in that secondhand reality is the fact that humans are very good at projecting into the immediate future the most probable continuation of what's been happening before, And as a result, we don't see the newness that is available all the time. And I don't, did I talk last time about the experiment with the, where they had someone watch a video with bouncing the basketballs? I'll say it again, even if I did. So this is a video, I'm sure it's on the internet. I think it was done at Harvard. And the instructions are, there's people in white shirts and black shirts, count how many times the ball is bounced in 1 minute. So you're diligently going, and then at the end it says, well, how many times did you get? And you, 32. And it says, well, it was, you know, maybe you're right or not. Now it says, now watch it again, and don't worry about counting, see if you notice anything. And I sure didn't notice this the first time. The whole time, right behind these people bouncing the ball is a man dressed in a gorilla suit, waving his arms back and forth, dancing back and forth. And I was totally blind to it because there was no conception of any possibility, well, that there'd be anything like this going on. This researcher has asked me to count basketballs bouncing. Of course, that's all that there is. And so I couldn't even see this thing right in front of me. So how much is there that we don't see that isn't so obvious right in front of us? I mean, the world is much more wonderful than the one we usually go around in. And that might be a good description of what benefits you get from spiritual awakening, living in a much more wonderful reality. And it doesn't mean you're spaced out. It means you're much more right in the thick of whatever it is that you're relating to, but you're accessing potentialities that you didn't previously know that you even had.
I had the same experience with that video.
Yeah, it's pretty humbling, right? So, well, I think we're coming to just a minute or two left. Any final thoughts or questions? We have 2 more of these, and I really appreciate everybody tuning in, those that are watching this now and talking about, we're not really limited to our usual sense of time. I've heard from some people that couldn't watch this live, so they're watching it later on. So I'm talking to you right now, and I'm very glad that you're watching this.
I want to say, oh, go ahead, Lee.
I didn't say anything.
Oh, there were some experiments that were done, I don't know how long ago, with water. Do you remember those where the molecular structure of the water changed under certain circumstances?
Well, there's a whole book, or at least or more, written about research that's been done with water. And yes, I do remember reading about that. And there's something, I think it's called cymatics, where someone's developed this tool to be able to, a sound is made and then it shows the standing waves that are generated. And it's totally different for different kinds of sounds, and it's really profoundly beautiful. But that's another good example that there's much more to the way the world is than meets the eye. So I guess we're going to have to stop for here. If you have any more questions or comments, if you go to the uumystics.org and you click on the flyer, picture of the flyer, and then scroll down that page, there's a place that you can leave questions or comments. And I do look at that from time to time, and I will be glad to respond to you and would welcome any thoughts or questions or desires you have for things you'd like to see included in a future one of these.
Well, we appreciate your time and interaction with our group, Don, and thank you all for joining us tonight. And with that, I'll conclude the recording and the session. Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great show.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.